Joe Whitaker was sipping his morning coffee on the porch swing when the tow truck hooked onto his RV like it was yesterday's trash. The soft creak of the swing, the smell of fresh-cut grass from Stanley's yard next door, and the sun just beginning to settle comfortably over Maple Creek Heights, everything about this Thursday morning should have been peaceful. But it wasn't. A yellow flyer had been slapped onto Joe's door the day before, flapping lightly in the dry Arizona breeze. He hadn't even read past the headline, some boilerplate HOA language about unauthorized vehicle presence. He'd crumpled it and tossed it in the kitchen bin. Later, he'd wish he hadn't. Now, as the hydraulic arms of the tow truck clamped down with mechanical finality, Joe rose slowly from the swing, coffee forgotten. His eyes narrowed. The RV, his retirement pride, freshly washed and packed for a trip to Yellowstone with his granddaughter, tilted as the front wheels lifted off the street. "Hey," he called, stepping off the porch. "What do you think you're doing?" The tow truck driver didn't answer, didn't even glance his way. A clipboard rested on the dashboard. His sunglasses reflected the sun like a mirror, emotionless. Joe moved faster, barefoot on hot pavement, but it was no use. The tow truck was already idling, ready to haul off weeks of planning and memory-making. The screen door slammed open behind him. Molly, still in her sleep shirt, rushed out. "Grandpa? The RV?" "Not now, sweet pea." Karen Delaney appeared like clockwork, striding down the sidewalk in tennis whites, clipboard of her own tucked under one arm. Her perfect blonde bob bounced with every step. "Mr. Whitaker," she said, not bothering with hello. "You've received multiple notices. Section 4.2 is quite clear." Joe turned to face her fully. "That's my vehicle. Parked in front of my home. We're leaving today. Family trip." Karen smiled with tight, lipless efficiency. "And Section 4.2 is still in effect. No street parking over 8 hours. It's been 12. We clocked it." Behind them, Frank stood near the mailbox, arms crossed but eyes down. He didn't speak, but later brought over a cherry pie in a reused ceramic dish, murmuring something about how he thought it was all a bit much. Joe's fists clenched at his sides. "This is harassment." Karen shrugged. "It's safety. Can't have large vehicles blocking visibility." Molly stepped beside him, clutching a half-filled backpack. "Can we still go?" He didn't answer. Instead, he turned back toward the house. Inside, he dialed Molly's mother, explained they'd have to delay. No reason to scare her with the details. By lunchtime, they sat at their usual booth in Marty's diner. Joe poked at his eggs while Molly scrolled her phone. The waitress, Betsy, topped off his coffee without asking. "You know," she said casually, setting down the pot, "my cousin lives 2 blocks over. Her car got towed for backing in instead of nosing forward. I told her to get a lawyer." Joe grunted. Molly nudged his arm. "Are you looking up bylaw stuff?" He angled his phone so she could see. Highlighted text read, "All enforcement actions shall be preceded by written notice and reasonable opportunity to comply." "Huh," she said. "Guess they skipped that step." Joe paid in cash, as always, sliding 2 bills into the check folder and leaving an extra $5 on the table. Betsy winked and gave him a gentle pat on the shoulder on her way past. Outside, the sky was still clear, heat rising in waves off the sidewalk. Joe and Molly lingered by the truck, now empty, no RV behind it. The parking space in front of the house looked unnaturally bare. Inside the cab, Molly clicked on her phone's voice recorder. "For school," she said when Joe raised an eyebrow. "Civic engagement project." He chuckled, the first smile of the morning breaking across his face. "You're going to get me in trouble." She leaned across the Formica table, voice soft but firm. "Grandpa, you're gonna fight back, right?" Joe hadn't opened his briefcase in 4 years, but that morning, he dusted it off and set it on the kitchen table like a war drum. It still had that faint smell of leather and old printer ink. The combination lock stuck for a second before giving way with a familiar click, and inside were legal pads, pens that had dried up long ago, and a yellowing copy of Arizona Civil Procedure. He didn't need the law anymore, not since retiring, but the law, it seemed, still needed him. The flyer was gone, but Joe found the bylaws in his email. The HOA had sent out a digital copy months ago, one he'd ignored. Now, as he flipped through the PDF on his laptop and scrawled notes in the margins of a legal pad, he noticed something Karen had failed to mention. Section 4.2 clearly stated that no vehicle shall be parked on the street for more than 8 hours, but enforcement required photographic evidence and a 3-day written notice delivered to the homeowner. Joe reread the sentence twice. There'd been no photos. No warning. Just a flyer and a tow truck. Convenient, he muttered. From the living room, the whir of a ceiling fan hummed like a slow summer clock. Molly peeked around the corner, holding 2 glasses of lemonade. Fuel, she offered, setting one beside him. Joe smiled. You're a good kid. She sat across from him, opening her laptop. You want to see something gross? On her screen was a Facebook group post, screenshot saved before it was taken down. Karen Delaney, in bold confidence, had written, another eyesore removed. #HOA victory. Just trying to keep our community looking clean and safe. Karen files, Molly explained. That's what people call it. Private group. She shares stuff like this all the time. Brag posts. Joe exhaled slowly. That's admissible. If this goes to mediation. Outside, the sun beat down like a slow drum roll. Frank appeared at the back door with a pitcher of lemonade, nodding politely before letting himself in. Brought refills, he said, glancing at the papers on the table. Looks like a courtroom in here. Joe motioned him in. Did you ever get one of these fine notices? Frank chuckled. Wind chime. Said it was too loud. Alice told me to ignore it. A week later it vanished from the porch. They sat for a while in the shade, glasses sweating on the table, the porch fan creaking overhead. Molly scribbled notes in a worn composition book, labeling a tab, Maple Creek Diaries. Later, she walked across the cul-de-sac, Mike tucked into her phone case, and sat beside Stanley. He remembered a time Karen had sent him a warning for his American flag being too faded. It was from my unit in Nam, he said, voice gravelly. Still flies just fine. Near the mailbox, Dennis ambled past with his usual stutter-step gait. Molly waved, and he offered a cautious smile. Sorry about your RV, he said quietly. It's okay, Molly replied. We're working on it. Dennis glanced back toward his mother's house. She did stuff like this back in Nevada. That's why we moved. Molly blinked. Really? He nodded, then walked off without another word. Joe, meanwhile, typed carefully on his ancient desktop. The letter was sharp but polite, legal where it counted, personal where it mattered. He cited Section 4.2, quoted HOA language verbatim, and demanded the immediate return of his RV or, failing that, a formal mediation hearing. He sent it to the HOA board and printed a hard copy for good measure. The next day, Ruth knocked lightly at the door. Her blouse was slightly rumpled, and she clutched a manila folder to her chest. Joe, she said, her voice low, let's not make this bigger than it is. We could just overlook this one. Joe raised an eyebrow. That's not how process works, Ruth. She swallowed. We don't want another situation. When she left, Joe watched her go, then returned to his desk. Molly sat nearby, cutting audio clips and labeling them by neighbor, Frank, wind chime. Stanley, flag. Ruth, nervous. That afternoon, a thick white envelope arrived in the mailbox. Inside was a formal letter from the HOA accusing Joe of harassment, warning that any further, combative behavior would incur a $200 fine. The language was sharp, impersonal, and clearly designed to intimidate. Joe set the letter down. The house was quiet except for the whir of the porch fan and the ice melting in a forgotten glass. He looked out the window toward Karen's house, then whispered to no one in particular. If they want a fight, they just woke up the wrong old man. The town clerk's office was dry and smelled of sun-bleached paper, but Joe's fingers danced like a pianist rediscovering old keys. He hadn't felt this particular type of purpose in years, methodical, focused, righteous. Boxes were stacked chest-high, labeled with faded marker, HOA minutes, HOA expenditures, HOA board correspondence. The deputy clerk, a young man with freckles and a suspiciously new haircut, had shown him to the back room and left without offering help. That suited Joe just fine. He pulled open the first box. Within minutes, he found what he needed, the financial disclosure filings from Maple Creek Heights. Or rather, the lack of them. According to HOA bylaws, the president was required to file quarterly summaries of neighborhood spending, with line-item votes from the board. The most recent filing was from early 2021, over 2 years ago. Karen had never followed protocol. Joe thumbed through folders until a name caught his eye, Delaney K. Attached was a form from the Nevada Homeowners Association registry. He held the sheet closer. Karen had served as president of a Las Vegas suburb HOA until stepping down under a pending ethics investigation. No further detail, but enough to raise eyebrows. He slipped the paper into a folder marked potential violations and moved on. Back at home, Joe's garage had transformed. The old lawn tools were shoved into a corner, and an old corkboard from Molly's science fair days now bore strings of red yarn connecting dates, bylaws, quotes, and photos. Printed screenshots of Karen's Facebook posts flanked a blown-up copy of Section 4.2. Molly had written intent in blue marker beside it. "That's our motive line," she'd said, tapping the yarn. Frank stopped by with a bag of plums and stayed to stare at the warboard. "Reminds me of your trial boards," he said. "You were born to file lawsuits in your sleep." Joe smirked. "Might have to prove you right." That evening, Molly met Ruth at the public library, where they sat in the history corner under the guise of scanning microfiche. Ruth's voice barely rose above a whisper. "There were these invoices last year," she said. "For decorative boulders in the Greenbelt median. We never voted on them. Karen just did it." Molly typed as Ruth spoke, labeling the notes budget abuse, boulders. "Do you still have copies?" Ruth nodded. "They're in the board Dropbox folder." "I'll share it." Quietly. The HOA meeting that week was unusually full. Joe showed up with a folder under his arm, Molly at his side. Karen stood at the front in a peach blazer, flanked by 2 board members who looked more confused than complicit. When Joe rose to speak, Karen's hand shot up. "Mr. Whitaker, we're not accepting comments on old business." He kept walking to the front. "I'd like the minutes to reflect that the board has failed to submit financial disclosures for 2 fiscal years, he said. "And that funds were spent without board approval." Karen's lips twitched, but Ruth interjected. "I believe we should let him finish." Joe turned to the crowd. "This is about transparency. About process. About accountability. The HOA doesn't own us, we own it." People clapped. Not many, but enough. Later, in the parking lot, Dennis stood beside the vending machine, kicking gravel with his sneaker. "I think I'm ready to help," he said, eyes avoiding Joe's. "Mom's not, well. She wasn't always like this, but now." Joe waited, not pressing. "I've seen things," Dennis added. "Invoices. Emails. Stuff she doesn't think anyone else can read." Back in the garage, the warboard grew. Joe hung up the photo of the Nevada resignation letter next to a copy of Maple Creek's bylaws. The contrast was stark, history repeating itself. Molly entered with a manila folder she'd borrowed from the HOA archive, labeled in Karen's tight handwriting. "Look what I found," she said, pulling out a yellow sticky note. She read aloud. "Silence Whitaker before July 1st. Karen's voice trembled for the first time at the HOA meeting, and the room noticed. The community clubhouse smelled faintly of citrus cleaner and old vinyl, the folding chairs set in uneven rows around a shaky microphone stand. It was the kind of Arizona evening where the heat finally relented but the air still hummed with leftover energy. On the refreshment table, a pitcher of lemonade sweated into a ring on the tablecloth. Joe sat near the front, Molly beside him with a spiral notebook on her lap. He clutched a worn manila folder like it was a trial brief. Around them, residents fanned themselves with HOA newsletters, trading looks more curious than concerned, at least for now. The microphone crackled. Karen tapped it, then straightened her blazer, eyes scanning the modest crowd. "Let's begin," she said, her tone clipped. Item 1, beautification funds for the south entrance median. Joe stood before she could continue. "Before we start new business," he said calmly, "I have documents relevant to this board's past actions." Karen's smile faltered. "This is neither the time nor the..." "Transparency is always timely," Joe interrupted, stepping to the mic. From his folder, he drew color-printed charts, expense records, even screen captures from HOA emails. He spoke slowly, each point a nail hammered into quiet murmurs. Funds allocated without votes. Ballots marked behind closed doors. Disclosures missed. And let me remind the board, procedural votes must be public and documented. Karen opened her mouth, but no words came out. Someone coughed. Another resident whispered, "Is that true?" Ruth cleared her throat from the far side of the table. "I can confirm, several vote sheets were filled out before the meetings even happened," she said, fingers twisting a pen cap. Karen submitted them as final. The murmurs grew louder. Frank leaned forward in his chair. Stanley, seated beside him, nodded slowly. Karen stepped back. "This is a coordinated smear campaign," she said. "Disgruntled residents don't dictate protocol." From the back of the room, Dennis rose, his posture hesitant but voice clear. "I've seen the emails," he said. "Invoices sent to vendors before any board approval. And expense reports filled out by me. At her request." Karen turned sharply. "Dennis." He didn't flinch. "You told me it was standard," he added quietly, as if to himself. "But it wasn't, was it?" The room fell into stunned silence. Karen's mouth opened, closed. Then she spun toward the exit. "This is outrageous," she snapped. "I won't entertain gossip." She shoved open the door and vanished into the dusk. The screen clattered as it swung shut behind her. After the meeting, Joe found Dennis sitting on the clubhouse steps, head in hands. Molly lingered behind, giving them space. "She'll be angry," Dennis muttered. Joe sat beside him, the heat from the pavement seeping through his slacks. "She's your mother," he said gently. "But that doesn't mean she's right." Dennis nodded, eyes glassy. "I didn't know where to draw the line," he whispered. Joe handed him a folder, copies of bylaws, notes, and annotated screenshots. "This time," Joe said, "let's do it the right way." Dennis looked at the folder, then at Joe. "I'm in." By the next morning, HOA board members had called for an emergency review, citing growing concerns from residents. A formal vote on leadership was scheduled for July 3rd. The news was posted on the community board, tucked between flyers for a 4th of July barbecue and a lost cat named Buttons. That afternoon, as the sun dipped low and porch fans whirred across the neighborhood, Molly walked past the clubhouse with her phone tucked discreetly at her side. She paused as she saw Karen outside her SUV, speaking tensely with a suited man holding a briefcase. Karen pointed animatedly at the building, then at a folded piece of paper. The man said nothing, just adjusted his tie. Karen's voice rose in frustration, and as she turned, her gaze locked onto Molly. For a moment, time stilled. Then Karen slammed the SUV door hard enough to make the window shake. Molly kept recording. On July 4th, red, white, and blue filled the streets, except for the house with the HOA president's blinds shut tight. The air over Maple Creek Heights shimmered in the afternoon heat. Porch flags flapped gently, and the smell of smoked ribs drifted over rows of lawn chairs lining the sidewalks. Children ran with pinwheels, their laughter mixing with bursts of jazz from the trio setting up on the cul-de-sac corner. Joe adjusted the brim of his sun hat and looked down the street, where Frank and Alice were already staking out their spot under a faded red umbrella. Molly trotted behind him, microphone in hand, her phone mounted to her belt. She was glowing. The Toad Truth podcast had gone live that morning, and within an hour, over 100 neighbors, past HOA members, and even a few local reporters had tuned in. "Think we'll get a quote from the jazz drummer?" she asked. "If we're lucky," Joe said, eyes flicking toward Karen's house, shutters closed, porch light off despite the daylight. There had been no post on the HOA board from her since the emergency vote had passed. 43-7. A landslide, and enough to remove her as president as of midnight. But Karen wasn't going quietly. Molly frowned. "Someone stuck these on mailboxes." She handed Joe a flyer, all caps, poorly formatted, typed in red ink. "This is a coup. HOA rules are under attack." Joe folded it neatly. "She's grasping." As the jazz trio launched into a slow rendition of America the Beautiful, the Unity Walk began. Joe took the lead, walking shoulder to shoulder with neighbors who once waved cautiously, now smiling freely. Ruth carried the lemonade pitcher. Frank brought an American flag from the Korean War era, and Stanley wore his old army cap. The walk passed Karen's house just as the trumpet hit its crescendo. Her door burst open. "You think this is over?" she yelled, waving an old HOA binder above her head. "This neighborhood was safe because of me. These files, these records, are mine." Molly instinctively raised her mic but stayed back. Joe kept walking. Dennis appeared behind his mother, gently taking her elbow. "Mom," he said softly, "enough." Karen shook him off. "They don't care, Dennis. They don't understand what I protected them from." "You falsified records," he said, louder now. "You lied." Karen blinked. The words seemed to land like hailstones. "I did it to keep things clean, organized. It wasn't personal. You know that." Ruth stepped forward. "Karen, it's time." Karen looked out at the silent crowd. Her shoulders sagged. Dennis guided her inside as Joe continued leading the Unity Walk down the street. Behind him, conversation resumed, lighter now, relieved. Children resumed waving flags. Laughter floated between houses. The spirit of the parade swelled again. Later that evening, while Joe and Molly sat beneath the shade of Frank's tree sipping lemonade, Molly's phone buzzed. She checked the screen, eyes widening. "A producer at KSPR Radio wants to talk about the podcast," she whispered. "Says we're giving voice to a growing movement." Joe smiled. "Told you those notes would come in handy." Across the street, Karen's windows stayed closed. Just as the sun dipped past the rooftops, casting long shadows down the street, a mail carrier in a holiday polo handed Joe a certified envelope. He thanked her, peeled it open, and scanned the top line. "From the county clerk," he murmured. Molly leaned closer. Joe read the sentence again, slower this time. "The lien's been approved. On Karen's property." He folded the letter, slid it back into the envelope, and looked out across the street, toward the darkened windows. "Happy 4th, he said. Karen's prized garden gnome collection stood silently as the county officer taped the notice on her door. It was early, barely past dawn. The monsoon clouds from the night before had left the sidewalks slick, the scent of wet creosote heavy in the air. Birds chirped cautiously. Maple Creek Heights was quiet, save for the sound of official tape being pressed firm against faded stucco. Joe stood behind his front window, coffee in hand, watching the officer fold the remaining papers and walk calmly back to the unmarked sedan. Across the street, the gnomes stared blankly from the flowerbed, frozen smiles framed by moss and gravel. One wore a faded Uncle Sam hat from last year's parade. Weeks earlier, Joe had filed the civil lien in person at the county courthouse. He hadn't told anyone except Molly. She'd called it his quiet nuke. Now it had landed, exactly as intended. He stepped into the kitchen, sorting final paperwork into a manila envelope. The counters were cleared, legal pads stacked neatly beside the toaster. He double-checked the filing number on the clerk's letter, nodded once, and tucked everything away. A knock sounded at the back door. Dennis stood there holding a plastic storage bin, his hair still damp from the rain. "She left this morning," he said, stepping in. "Didn't say goodbye. Just handed me her HOA files and told me not to follow." Joe glanced down at the bin, labeled in neat, obsessive handwriting, "Archives, Maple Creek 2022 to 2023. "She won't need them anymore," Dennis added. They sat at the kitchen table, the hum of the fridge filling the silence. "You gonna be all right?" Joe asked. Dennis nodded, though his eyes didn't quite match. "It's weird. I'm angry at her, but mostly, I'm just tired. She thought she was protecting everyone, but she only protected her own rules. Control is a funny thing," Joe said. "Feels like safety until it's not." They drank coffee in silence. After a while, Dennis got up, thanked Joe, and said he'd offered to help Ruth audit the HOA's remaining files. Joe didn't ask why. He knew what the gesture meant. That afternoon, Molly released the newest podcast episode, The Final Hearing. It opened with Ruth's voice, shaking slightly but steady enough. "I knew what Karen was doing wasn't right, but I didn't know how to stop it until Joe asked the right questions." The downloads doubled in 2 hours. By evening, the storm clouds returned, building slow and ominous over the ridgeline. Joe pulled the repaired RV into the driveway. Its paint glistened, new window seals intact, tires fully pressurized. Molly ran her fingers along the side panel. "You sure we're really going this time?" she teased. Joe opened the driver's door, paused, then turned to the porch. He walked up the steps and disappeared inside for a moment. When he came back, he was holding a shoebox. On the lid, scrawled in Sharpie, "HOA, done." He placed it behind the passenger seat. "Now I'm sure." Molly grinned and hopped in. "You bringing the podcast mic?" "I'm bringing peace and quiet," Joe said. A rumble of thunder rolled low across the horizon. As they buckled up, Karen's house stood still behind them. The gnomes remained at attention, now just part of the scenery. Joe turned the key in the ignition. The RV engine roared to life. "So," he said, glancing at Molly. She flashed a wide smile. "Yellowstone?" For the first time in weeks, Joe felt the wind in his hair, not from worry, but from an open highway. They'd left Prescott at sunrise, the RV humming like a hymn as it climbed north along I-17. The windows were cracked just enough to let in desert air and the scent of creosote, while a quiet classic rock station drifted in and out of static. Molly sat in the passenger seat with her feet tucked up, a notebook in her lap, earbuds dangling. "Another message just came in," she said, tapping her phone. Joe glanced her way. "It's from a woman in Michigan. Says she's printing out your letter to use in her HOA case. Wants to know if you're on Facebook." He chuckled, "Tell her I'm analog and proud of it." As they drove past a line of rusted mailboxes and a faded Route 66 mural, Molly played a few more voicemails. A man's voice cracked with emotion, thank you both. You reminded us that we're not powerless." Joe gripped the wheel a little tighter, not from tension, but from meaning. They passed a sign for Flagstaff and pulled into a roadside diner shaped like an old caboose. The waitress, Loretta, brought them chicken fried steak and sweet tea without looking at a menu. "I heard about you too," she said, setting down the plates. "HOA showdown in Prescott, right?" Joe smiled politely. Loretta leaned on the counter. "Had my own run-in with ours back in '09. They fined me for hanging a flag too early in July. Said it was disruptive. So I lit sparklers every morning that month just to spite them." Joe chuckled, and for a moment, the tension from months of quiet battles melted into a kind of fellowship. Over lemon pie, Joe found himself telling her about his late wife, how they'd once mapped out an RV trip to Yellowstone on a napkin, right there in that same stretch of Arizona. "She passed before we got to go," he said softly. Molly reached over and squeezed his hand. She'd be proud we're doing it now. They took turns driving as the landscape shifted. Red rocks gave way to pine forests. At a canyon overlook just before the Utah border, they stopped. The air was crisp and silent. Joe set up his old tripod and balanced the phone camera. "Ready?" he asked. Molly nodded. They smiled, not performatively, but with a genuine ease that had been absent for weeks. The picture caught them mid-laugh, the canyon behind them stretching wide and impossible. Later that evening, as they crossed into Utah, Molly uploaded one final podcast for the trip. She called it Porch Justice, The Road Home. The audio opened with a soft harmonica and Joe's voice saying, "Sometimes you fight the loudest by staying steady." She narrated memories from the HOA saga, interwoven with new roadside reflections. "Justice doesn't always wear a robe," she said, echoing her earlier words. "Sometimes, it wears denim and drives an RV." They parked for the night under a sky so clear, Joe joked he could read by starlight. Just before sleep, Molly checked her email and froze. "Grandpa," she said. He raised an eyebrow. "It's from a town in Colorado. Small place, Oak Ridge. Their HOA's gone off the rails, apparently. They want to know if you'd be willing to talk to them." Joe didn't answer right away. He looked out the window at the stars, at the darkened highway stretching out like a second chance. "We'll see," he said. "Let's get to Yellowstone first." Back in Prescott, the porch swing creaked gently, just the way Joe remembered it. It was late August, and the heat had softened into something almost kind. The monsoon storms had passed, leaving behind cleaner sidewalks and hummingbird sightings in the early morning. Joe sat on the swing with a glass of iced tea, watching the street with a kind of quiet he hadn't known he missed. Across the way, a moving truck idled in front of the Macon house. A young family wrestled with cardboard boxes while two children chased each other up and down the driveway. Stanley waved from his yard, holding a welcome basket. Frank walked over to offer extra tape. It was the kind of neighborhood moment people forget to appreciate, unless they know what it took to earn it. Molly stepped out holding her phone and a slice of apple pie, warm from the oven. "You know you're kind of famous now, right?" she grinned. "Local famous," Joe muttered. "The podcast got nominated. Youth Civic Journalism category." He smiled without looking up. "That's your award, not mine." "Well, it started with your porch." She took a bite and let the fan hum between them. That week, the newly restructured HOA met in the clubhouse. Ruth, now fully elected president, wore a blue cardigan with embroidered lemons. She called the meeting to order with a soft gavel tap and a smile. On the agenda, restoring community RV access, new transparency policies, and a welcome vote for the new family on Cedar Lane. "Motion to approve RV lot reopening?" she asked. "Approved," came the unanimous reply. Afterward, Ruth approached Joe and handed him a small potted succulent. "You earned a soft landing," she said. Dennis stopped by later that day, carrying a folder and a hopeful face. "I'm working with Ruth now. Audit committee. It feels good." Joe clapped him on the shoulder. "Feels like legacy." At the diner that night, Joe declined an offer to run for HOA board. "I'm not made for meetings anymore," he said. "But I'll teach civics on Thursdays, if the community center still takes guest instructors." "They'd be lucky," said Alice, refilling his coffee before he could ask. Later, Molly helped him sort the last of the RV supplies in the garage. "So, are we done with HOA battles?" Joe chuckled. "For now." Back on the porch, he unfolded a letter postmarked from Kansas. The handwriting was tidy, careful. "Dear Joe," it read. "Thanks to you, we finally found our voice. Our HOA backed off last month. No more fines for Christmas lights. We're not afraid anymore." He folded it and slid it under the ceramic gnome on the porch railing. Out front, a pair of kids coasted by on bikes, streamers catching the light. No citations. No clipboard watchers. Just kids being kids. The fan oscillated. The porch smelled like pie and sunscreen. Molly poked her head out the screen door. Another email. Someone in Henderson says their HOA is in trouble. Joe raised an eyebrow. She grinned. They're asking for your number. He leaned back, stretched his legs, and let the swing carry him gently forward. Tell them I'll call next week, he said. Right now, I'm off duty. And the porch, faithful as ever, creaked once more into stillness. The porch swing swayed gently, not from wind, but from peace long earned. What began with a towed RV ended in a neighborhood rediscovering its voice, one quiet act of resistance at a time. Rules, like fences, should protect, not confine. When a community chooses fairness over fear, even the smallest front yard can feel like home again. And sometimes, the loudest justice is found in the hush of a summer evening, right where the porch light never went out.